probably the best way to start any program on California outdoors or the Bay Area is with our state flower, which we all know as the California poppy. And it's actually been officially our state flower since 1904 by act of the legislature. But it was first described scientifically long before that. Of course, it was known by the Native Americans and the Spanish that settled first before that. But let's see. In 1807 or 1817, sorry, the Russian ship of exploration, the Rurik, sailed into San Francisco Bay and docked at the Presidio. And on board, there was a naturalist, a gentleman named Eldebert von Chamisso. It's a great name. And the Comandante of the Presidio came out to meet the ship, and I don't think he was too thrilled to have a Russian ship come into the bay without prior warning, but he was delighted to find out that there was a naturalist on board. And he met Chamisso and he said, well, come with me, I want to show you something. And they rode out to a hillside in San Francisco, and that hillside was covered with poppies. And Chamisso was duly impressed. This was fairly late in the season, and to see something covered with flowers made a great impression. But you know what they say about the poppy, our California poppy, somewhere in California, no matter what the season, there's always a poppy in bloom. So Chamisso collected a few of the poppies and he took them back to the Rurik, and he determined, well, it hadn't been described scientifically before. And he decided he would name the flower after his friend, his best friend on the ship, the ship's surgeon, the Estonian surgeon, whose name was Johann Friedrich von Eschscholtz, an even more distinguished sounding name than Chamisso. Any name that's got an SC, two SCHs in a row warrants special notice. So that's the scientific name of our state flower, Eschscholtzia californica. And one of the things that Chamisso noticed, one of the distinguishing characteristics of our poppy, beneath the petals, and here's a flower where the petals have fallen off, that little disc, that's how you know you've got our California poppy. It's called a torus. Well, here's our state flower growing on our state rock. It's, some of you may know, it's serpentinite or serpentine. And usually it's not a place where you see a lot of plants growing. It's very difficult to grow in serpentine soil. It's an ultramafic rock, serpentinite is. It's got lots of iron and magnesium, very little calcium, and it's got minerals that are poisonous to many plants like nickel and chromium. But it turns out a lot of our native plants have evolved to grow up with serpentine. The non-natives don't like it very much, so it's really an enclave for native plants, as you see with our poppies here. And botanists tell us that 0.5% of California is serpentine soil, but 10% of our endemic species that only grow in California and nowhere else in the world grow on serpentine. And here's one flower we see on our Greenbelt outings that grows on serpentine. It grows over on Ring Mountain, the Tiburon mariposa lily. And this is, well, not only is it endemic to California, it's endemic to Ring Mountain. That's the only place in the world that it grows. And we get to visit it each year about the time it's blooming on a Greenbelt Alliance outing, usually the last weekend in May or the first one in June. A couple of years ago, I got a phone call before, or an email before one of our outings, and a gentleman on the phone said, you know, I'm the guy that first collected that flower back in the early 1970s. I was a grad student at UC Berkeley, and we were doing an inventory of rare plants because there was a development project proposed for Ring Mountain, and we actually wanted to stop it. And he said, I haven't been back for 50 years. Could I join your outing? I say, sure. So we got him up there. That's the fellow in the light blue shirt. And he was there regaling us with tales of how he found this flower in the early 1970s. There's our outings leader, Kathy Petrick, and she'll be leading the outing again in late May, so you can look for that. Well, eventually the Ruriks sailed back out towards Russia, apparently into more stormy seas than when they entered, carrying with it that botanical cargo with the poppies. And the interesting thing is, to this day, that type specimen, the original flower that Chamisso collected, the one that you have to have those characteristics to be considered the California poppy, it's still in Russia after all those years. It's in a museum in St. Petersburg, and I'm pretty sure Putin's not going to give it back. There's a few other flowers that we occasionally see on our outings and that you may see around the Bay Area. They've got the name poppy in it. They're kind of cousins to that golden poppy. They're not real closely related. One is a wind poppy and the other is fire poppy. And they're on long stalks, kind of delicate looking. And they're fire followers. You only see them bloom immediately after a fire. Right after, well, their seeds lie dormant in the soil can be for decades until a fire races through, cracks the seeds, so water can enter and they can start to grow. They love it after a fire because there's lots of extra nitrogen and phosphorus in the soil. Their growth is stimulated by the leachates from the burn and the smoke. So they're ephemeral. They only last a few years after a fire. So often on our Greenbelt outings, we visit areas that have been burned recently, and we get to see these delicate little flowers. Oh, well, what happened to Chamisso after the voyage? Well, for several years, he won the award for the best hair on any 19th century naturalist. Look at those flowing locks. But if you look him up on the web, you might not be, you'll probably be sent to a poetry website. He had quite an interesting resume. If you asked him about his life and how he self-identified, he would look you in the eye and he'd say, French aristocrat by birth, Prussian soldier by training, poet by disposition, naturalist by choice. And he's famous. His most famous literary work was a book called Peter Schlemiel. And you might recognize Schlemiel as a Yiddish word. And I think it means someone who is very unlucky in his endeavors and makes some very bad deals. And Peter Schlemiel was a sailor, and he returned from a long voyage after several years. And his fiancée, who had waited patiently all this time, was eager to marry, but of course, Peter had no money. So he kind of muttered to himself, gee, I'd give anything for some money. Well, that's the wrong thing to say when the devil is lurking around, and the devil, as you can see in the picture, materialized, and the two of them made a deal. In exchange for Peter Schlemiel's shadow, the devil would give Peter a bottomless purse of gold. That sounds like a no-brainer, but spoiler alert, things did not turn out well for Peter. And as I mentioned, Schlemiel in Yiddish means someone that is very unlucky in his dealings. If you go to, I went to a Yiddish dictionary to try to get some enlightenment here, and the example it gave, Jerry Seinfeld was always a Schlemiel, and George Costanza was a Schlemazel, if that helps. Well, what happened to Eschholz? Well, he won the award for having the very best sideburns of any 19th century naturalist, but he turned out he went back to the West Coast and to California in 1824, this time as chief naturalist on the Rurik. And Eschholz was actually a trained herpetologist. an expert on reptiles and amphibians and snakes, well, and snakes as part of reptiles. And it turns out that 1824 expedition along the west coast of North America, they were the first ones to scientifically describe a lot of the reptiles and amphibians that we see on our outings and our hikes. This was one of them, and we all know this guy, Western fence lizard, probably our most common reptile. And they're kind of easy to recognize when you see them, even if you don't get a good look. Reptiles, well, herpetologists say they move with that sprawling reptilian gait. You know, they kind of waddle from side to side. But when you see a Western fence lizard that wants to get away from you, it moves pretty quickly. It moves like it's got little wheels underneath. So no sprawling reptilian gait for this guy. And in fact, one of the alternate names people call them, its nickname is Swifts. They're called Swifts because they move so quickly. Also called bluebellies. They've got a blue chest, both the male and the female. The males are a little bit darker blue and the males have a blue chin also. And when you come upon one, especially if you're wearing a blue shirt or a blue sweatshirt, the little fence lizard will start doing push-ups. That's to warn you that that's his territory or her territory. And the males do it to impress the females. They probably also do it to get, when they need to cool down, do some thermal regulations, get off the hot ground. And it helps them see a little bit better, gets them a few inches more off the ground. So bluebellies. And of course, they become local heroes in the last few decades. This poor guy has seen better days, but those little spots, those little growths, they're in fact ticks. Western fence lizards, well, of course, we have one species of tick that carries Lyme disease, Ixodes, I think, pacifica. And ticks need three blood meals during their lives. They take one blood meal as a nymph, one as a larva, and then one as adult. So their first meal as a nymph, if it's on a mouse or a deer that's infected with Lyme disease, the ticks pick up the Lyme disease. Well, if their second meal happens to be a Western fence lizard, like these poor guys here, like this poor guy here, turns out there's a protein in the lizard's blood that actually kills the spirochete, the Lyme disease causing spirochete bacteria right in the gut of the tick. So by the time it falls off and we're the third meal, well, at least the tick is clean. It doesn't have Lyme disease. And that's one reason that the incidence of Lyme disease is so much lower in California and the West Coast than it is back east. We have the Western fence lizard to thank for that. Another interesting thing, and perhaps you've seen one looking like this, they can drop their tails. If a predator grabs them by the tail, there's a weak spot in the vertebrae that breaks off. The loose tail goes slithering away, hopefully with the predator in pursuit. And there's powerful muscles in the what's left of the tail that squeeze the blood vessels closed so the little fence lizard doesn't bleed to death. And that's actually called autotomy. If you're a critter that can shed a body part, and I'm sure you can think of others that can do the same thing. Now, eventually the tail grows back as cartilage. And it's not ideal for the poor lizard at this state because it stores fat, it stores food in the tail, and it uses the tail for balance and locomotion. But I gotta say it beats the alternative. And if you look carefully at the other side, right there at the top of the head, that looks very strange. It almost looks like an eye. And that's exactly what it is. Western fence lizards have three eyes. They got the two that we recognize, and this one on top of the head. It's got a scale over it, and herpetologists have long puzzled over what it's used for, and there's two main theories. I mean, it detects light, that's established, and it may be used by the Western fence lizard to regulate its hormone production. it's sidereal horm hormones and its sidereal patterns through its life. The second idea is it detects polarized light. So it's a direction finding aid. It knows where it's going and it can find its way back to its den or its home territory if it needs to. But very interesting creatures with 3 eyes, and now you know. Well, with the rains we've had, we should get some great ponds this year. It wasn't too good last year. This happens to be Coulter pine on Mount Diablo, one of the ones that we visit. There'll be plenty in the East Bay Regional Parks and over in Marin. And one of the common amphibians we find in the ponds, Pacific tree frog, which is the way most of us learned it. I think the preferred name now, common name, is Pacific chorus frog. They're the little guys just a couple of inches long that make the big noise that you hear coming from the pond, and the noise that you hear at night that some people love and some people can't stand because it keeps them awake. And Pacific chorus frogs, tree frogs, they have a few interesting characteristics too. This frog is green and this frog is brownish. They can change color. They have special branched skin cells. And when they want to appear dark, or there's melanin, the dark pigment in the skin cells, when they want to appear green, that melanin is concentrated in the middle of the skin cell. But when they're in a darker brownish area and they want to turn color, that pigment diffuses out into the branches of the skin cell and they can become brown. Great camouflage. They've also got that stripe across the eye, which helps them. So if a creature has coloration that helps it hide, it's called cryptic coloration. They're being cryptic. And of course, they have the noticeable pads on their toes that are great for climbing, not just trees, but all sorts of vegetation. This pond is in Briones Regional Park. This is Marisich Lagoon, where we'll visit next month. Not to see the tree frogs, but to see another amphibian, our wonderful newts. And newts are a type of salamander. People often wonder what the difference is between a newt and a salamander. And if you want to really confuse them, you can just say, well, all newts are salamanders, but all salamanders aren't newts. And it turns out a newt is a type of salamander that spends part of its life on land, but then returns to the water where it was born to mate and to lay eggs. And during their terrestrial stage, they have rough skin and a kind of a narrow tail. And when they return to the water, their skin becomes smooth, their tail turns into a paddle, and the males at least get pads on their toes. So they spend the summers up in the forested areas, usually under leaf litter, kind of just hanging out there, be doing their estivation or at least their summer torpor. And with the first big rain, they kind of come to life. They chow down in invertebrates such as earthworms. And with the second big rain, the males head down to the pond or the stream where they were born. And how they find it, sometimes it's over a mile away. It's thought to be sense of smell. The females don't go right away. They wait for some more rain. They're smart. They're not going to head down and waste their time laying eggs when there's not going to be enough water for the eggs to hatch. No, here we go. Here's the males. You see they've got the paddle tails, anxiously waiting for the gals to arrive. And this year we've certainly got enough rain. The males are down in the ponds already. And the thing is, if you're a female, you do not want to be the first female at the pond. Yeah, it's called a newt ball. Eventually they get it all sorted out. And what happens is a male newt will mount the female, he'll climb on her back. That's what he uses those pads on his toes for. And he rubs his chin on the back of her head. And there's hormones that he passes on, kind of a newt version of aqua velva, some aftershave or some scent that the female can't resist. He dismounts and he starts to walk across the bottom of the pond, and she follows. She just thinks he's wonderful now. And somewhere along the bottom, he drops a little spermatophore, little case of sperm, and keeps walking. And she walks over it and she picks it up in her cloacal vent. And that's how they do it. That's how the eggs get fertilized. So it's internal fertilization. And well, you wonder, these guys are cute little guys, and they, got no claws. They got little pegs for teeth. They're slow. And of course, they're not even camouflaged. They're not cryptic. You wouldn't be orange underneath if you wanted to say hidden. So what's their defense? Why don't they all get eaten on the way to the pond? Well, if a newt is disturbed or scared, this is what it does. It's called the Unken reflex. It arches its neck and its tail, and it shows you that orange color. And remember, orange is one of nature's warning signals. Remember the orange and black of the monarch butterfly? The newt's defense is that its skin is poisonous. They are definitely not a survival food. The skin of a newt is filled with tetrodotoxin. And if you can come on our outing, we'll explain the difference, how you can tell the rough-skinned newt from the California newt. They kind of look alike, but they're both filled with tetrodotoxin. The rough-skinned newt has a lot more, but either one would kill you. And so that's their big defense. And tetrodotoxin, it might kind of ring a bell, because there's lots of animals that have that poison. Turns out there's some species of octopi that have tetrodotoxin. The pufferfish that you can get in Japanese restaurants, they have to be prepared specially because they've got tetrodotoxin. And scientists have often wondered, well, these animals aren't that closely related. How could they all separately evolve tetrodotoxin as a defense? And it turns out they didn't, at least in case of the newt. In the case of the newt, it's actually a little bacteria that lives on the skin that produces the poison. So it's a symbiotic relationship between the newt and that bacteria. The bacteria gets a safe place to live. The bacteria gets a safe place to live, and the newt gets its very own home defense system, the tetrodotoxin produced by the bacteria. There's actually only one critter that can eat newts safely, and it's our couple species of garter snakes. And you don't have to know the difference between Diablo range and coastal garter snake. They actually used to be called terrestrial and aquatic garter snakes. But just look for that stripe along the back, like a garter. And they can eat newts. It turns out tetrodotoxin, the molecule works by, it plugs up the little synapses and sodium ion channels that your nerve impulses follow. So the little molecule plugs those up and it disrupts the nerve impulses. So you become paralyzed. The breathing is the first thing that goes, and then you slowly die after that, or quickly die. It turns out, though, those little gaps in the synapses for garter snakes are the wrong shape. The little tetrodotoxin molecules don't fit. It's like sticking the wrong key into a door. So they can get away with eating them. And sometimes in the ponds at Briones, we'll see one or two garter snakes, and that's bad news for the newts. Garter snakes are some of the first snakes that we see each year on our outings. They're actually more cold tolerant than other snakes. They're kind of interesting because they give birth to live young, which there's a few other snakes that do that too. You think that all reptiles lay those eggs. Well, if you're a placental mammal, of course, you have live birth, you're viviparous. If you lay eggs like a Western fence lizard and they hatch from the eggs, you're oviparous. But it turns out what garter snakes do, they hold the eggs inside their body. They hatch inside mama garter snake, and then they're born alive. So that's called ovoviviparous. Well, pretty interesting snakes too. Okay, well, so we had the award for the best sideburns and the best hair. I guess John C. Fremont wins the award for the most dashing, handsome naturalist in the 19th century. And he was really, of course, we all know him here in California. He was, seems like he was involved in quite a bit. We've got a city named after him. John C. Fremont was instrumental in the Bear Flag Revolt. He named the Golden Gate Bridge. He was our first state senator. He went on to be territorial governor of Arizona. And he was a kind of a pain in the neck to Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War as a kind of a inept political general. And he was actually born into really modest circumstances. And he might have had quite an undistinguished life, except for the big break in his life, when as a young man, he met a woman named Jessie Benton, and it was love at first sight. And Jessie Benton happened to be the daughter of US Senator Thomas Hart Benton, who from Missouri, and he was quite instrumental in pushing for the railroads, and he actually lost his seat. He was from Missouri and he was opposed to slavery, and it eventually cost him his seat in the Senate. But anyway, he didn't think much of Fremont, and he was against the liaison. So Jessie and John C. Fremont eloped. And once they were married, Thomas Hart Benton kind of accepted the relationship, and he always had Fremont's back. Fremont joined the Army Topographic Corps. He had led 3 topographic expeditions in the 1840s in the West, and the first one at least was to California, and I believe one of the later ones. And these expeditions always went amok in one way or the other. But Fremont always survived because Thomas Hart Benton had his back and got him another expedition, but mostly because Jessie Benton took Fremont's journals and diaries, which were kind of boring and dull, and she rewrote them to make them exciting, swashbuckling adventures. Kind of like what Jesse Brennan has done for all of us these years at Greenbelt Alliance, making everybody look a lot better than they probably deserve, especially me. Oh, thank you, Jesse. This is probably how Jesse rewrote them, Jessie Benton. And there she is. She made a hero, a hero out of Fremont. She made a hero out of his favorite scout, Kit Carson. That's Kit. There's Fremont sitting down. There's Kit Carson there to his left. And in the picture to the right, there's Kit Carson saving Fremont one of the many times. Anyway, even though his topographic expeditions left something to be desired, he did do some very good botany work on those expeditions. And we have quite a number of plant species named after him. One of them is the Fremont cottonwood that we see often. It's a kind of a riparian tree. We see it near creek beds. And it's got the little leaves that wave like flags in the wind, quite a beautiful tree. And the way it got its name is from the seeds, which looks like fluffy balls of cotton. Fremont used to call the tree, he called it sweet bark, because his pack animals used to love to nibble on the bark of the cottonwood. Another one named after Fremont is this one, which is quite rare in the Bay Area, Fremont's bush mallow. We see it every year on some of our hikes on Mount Diablo. It's a fire follower, like the wind and the fire poppy. And this is on the Globe Lily Trail, not far from the Mitchell Canyon trailhead. And there's 3 left. The hillside was covered after a huge fire in 1977. The hillside was covered with bush mallow, but they're all gone now, except for 3 that are left. They've all been crowded out by other chaparral plants. But they do have quite a beautiful flower that we get to see each spring. Another one that we'll see tomorrow. We have a nice outing to Sibley Regional Park in the East Bay Regional Park District. And this is Fremont silk tassel. And you can see how it's got its name. It's got both male and female flowers that dangle from the trees like tassels. But my very favorite of the ones named for Fremont, we'll see in probably probably next month or early March, Fremont star lily, which if you've done any hiking in the Bay Area, you've been on our outings, our spring outings, you've seen this one. And it's easy to recognize. It's got the kind of the long basal leaves and a long stalk and the pretty white flowers. And and of course, a bulb underground. It's in the lily family. And many of the lilies were used by the Native Americans were edible, but not this one. You wouldn't want to mess with this one because the alternate name, common name for Fremont star lily is Death Camus. It's poisonous, at least the bulb. And it's interesting because one of the flowers that we see growing, sometimes among the star lily and sometimes right in the general vicinity, is this one, which looks quite a bit like it, soap plant or a moly. It's got the long leaves too. They have wavy margins instead of straight margins, and they have a long flower stalk and a white flower. But, whoops. There we go. Generally, well, the kids call it the grocery store plant. And let's say, and it had many, many uses for the Native Americans, for the indigenous people. So let's say you were out somewhere, not in any of the regional parks or the state parks or the Marin County parks or down in Mid-Peninsula. You were out somewhere in the Sierra foothills and you were totally lost and in big trouble. So first thing you'd have to do is to look for some of this soap plant. And you'd have to dig some of them out because underground, there's this bulb. And you want to carefully peel the bulb. Peel the fibers away. Save the fibers, don't throw them away. And underneath, there's a little white bulb that if you can start a fire and cook it, well, it's edible. It supposedly tastes like a potato or an onion. Some of the bulbs you'll want to peel, not necessarily roast, but there's a white juice, saponin, that's on the bulb. And if you're near a source of water, you can lather up and get clean. So you might be lost, but at least you'll be clean and your mother would be happy. But if you're going to wash your hair with the soap root saponin, you want to dry it. You want to rinse it out really well because once that juice dries, comes a glue, and then you'll be looking like Bigfoot and you never would get rescued. But what the Native Americans used to do is they take those fibers and the glue and make soap plant brushes. And there's the glue, and those are the fibers. And you can still, throughout the Bay Area, every so often, you'll see a Native people's kind of skills course. And one of the activities they may have is making soap plant brushes. I know years and years ago, I took one at Coyote Hills Regional Park for the East Bay Regional Park District. My brush didn't come out looking that good. And like the Fremont star lily, it also has a really nice looking white flower. The problem is the flower is closed all day. It opens up just a couple hours before sunset. It's open all night and then closes in the morning. The scientific name is post-meridium afternoon. And we get to see it a couple times a year. We do evening hikes on Mount Diablo. We have a summer solstice hike when we get to see these all opened up. And it was long assumed, since it was an evening bloomer, that the main pollinator were night-flying moths and maybe night-flying beetles. But it turns out they visit the flower too, probably. But the main pollinator are native bumblebees, yellow-faced bumblebees. It's the very last thing in the late afternoon the bumblebees visit. And if you can put it on your calendar to come to our summer solstice outing that's led by Liz Watson, we get to see the flowers open and the bumblebees are all over them. So again, here's the Fremont star lily, the death camas, and so plant, the grocery store plant. Well, one more group to talk about here, and they sure don't look like naturalists, but they are, was the California Geologic Survey. The survey was formed by our state legislature in 1860. They had the idea, let's hire some top flight geologists, send them all over the state, and they could figure out where all the gold and silver and valuable ores are and make maps. And the survey was delighted when the most prominent geologist in the country, the man in the middle here, a professor at Harvard, no less, Josiah Whitney, agreed to lead the expedition, to come all the way out to the backwater of California to leave his teaching post. Well, the legislature wouldn't have been so pleased if they knew what Whitney had in mind. He wasn't that much interested in doing a mineral survey. He was going to show the world how a scientific survey should be run. He was going to do geology. He was going to do topography. He was going to do paleontology. And he was going to do botany. And towards that end, he hired the gentleman at the right here, a school teacher from New York named William Brewer, whose specialty was botany as the survey's botanist. And he also kept the journal during the survey's travels through California. So he was the journalist and the botanist. So these guys, late 1860, and they head out. Their first stop is the Sierra Nevada, and they're all busy naming mountains after themselves. Everybody in the party's got a mountain named after them. And they get this wire from the state legislature. It says, stop what you're doing. We want you to go back to the Bay Area, specifically stop at Mount Diablo. There's a lot of mining activity going on. We want to know if it's worth anything. Well, Whitney didn't like that. He didn't like being told what to do. He said, so he grumbled, this is a scientific expedition, not a prospecting party. But they went and they set up camp on Mount Diablo. And what the legislature was interested in, 1860s was really the start of a great mining era on Mount Diablo. Over in the northern foothills, coal was discovered. An area which now East Bay Regional Park, Black Diamond Mines Regional Preserve. And for several decades, the Mount Diablo coal fields and Black Diamond Mines were the most important coal fields in California. Over on the north side of, no, on the east side of North Peak, the direction right there, mercury was discovered, quicksilver. And that mining actually went on and off for almost 100 years, and we're still dealing with the environmental impacts from the mercury mines. And in Mitchell Canyon and on Eagle Peak, copper was discovered. So the survey, they set up camp in Mitchell Canyon. This is kind of really close to where we start our outings. But this was the scene in 1861. This is Whitney. Here's Brewer. And they set to work. And pretty soon, Whitney kind of changed his tune about Mount Diablo. he noticed all the different types of rocks and different strata that could be found on the mountain. And he said, well, gee, he said to his survey team, we're going to stay here for a while because I'm pretty sure if we can figure out the geology of Mount Diablo, that holds the key to understanding the Coast Range of California. So they set out to exploring, and a little bit later in the year, we'll do an outing, kind of a car caravan, and stop at various spots at Mount Diablo and explore 190 years, 190 million years of geologic history. So Whitney had it right. But while his buddies were looking at the rocks, Brewer was looking at the plants. One of the ones that he found, and one of the ones that we see towards the summit of the mountain, is Brewer's rock cress, one of the really rare rock cress species. I think it's on, they found it on, the Geologic Survey found it on top of Mount Hamilton too. It's a real pretty flower growing out of the Franciscan rock. He found this one, Mount Diablo buckwheat, kind of a delicate little flower. The interesting thing is, in 1936, long after the survey was done, a young grad student from UC Berkeley named Mary Bowerman was sent to Mount Diablo due to a survey of the plant species there as her graduate thesis. She was the only woman in her class, and Mount Diablo is kind of seemed like the most difficult assignment. All the men got the close-in Berkeley Hills assignments, and people always attributed it to Mary Bowerman's great skills being recognized. Now, she went on to be one of the legendary botanists of the Bay Area, but Mary Bowerman always said she got the Mount Diablo assignment because she was the only one in the class that had a car. But anyway, she did her great survey in 1936, and she found Mount Diablo buckwheat, but nobody saw it after that. It was thought to have gone extinct until 70 years later, another grad student from UC Berkeley, Michael Park, found it growing on a little patch of land that Save Mount Diablo had just acquired adjacent to Mount Diablo. So it's kind of interesting. Mary Bowerman went on to found the land trust, Save Mount Diablo, one of our partners, and the land was acquired by Save Mount Diablo, and one of the fellow grad students, a couple generations removed, found that plant, thought to be extinct. And since then, it's been found in a couple of other places, including a hillside near Black Diamond's Regional Preserve. So it appears it's not quite on the verge of extinction. Of course, all the sites are secret. Well, poor Brewer's doing his botany work, and he kind of expected when he came out to California, and might be on the lookout for mountain lions and grizzly bears. He did not expect giant spiders, which he found quite disturbing. He wrote in the journal, oh, they got these spiders on Mount Diablo. They're the size of a half-grown mouse, with fangs the size of a rattlesnake's, and a bite generally considered fatal. Pleasant traveling companions. Well, he was wrong on the last part, at least. Tarantulas are harmless. We call them Mount Diablos, but the gentle giants of Mount Diablo, or the teddy bears of Mount Diablo. Liz Watson does an outing, tarantula outing, each year that help a little bit with, and there's outings at Black Diamond Mines Regional Parks with the East Bay Regional Park District and Del Val and Sunol. Here's a little tarantula crossing the road. We're all trying to figure out why the spider crossed the road. Well, looking for a mate. And Liz has got a pet tarantula, Scarlet O'Hairy, that anybody who's up to the task gets to handle there. Anita was quite happy with it. She used to work for Greenbelt Alliance. A young kid wasn't quite sure about it. And spiders weren't the only thing that plagued poor William Brewer. One day they were getting off their mounts to rest, and Brewer swung off the horse and came down, and he felt something squishy under his feet, under his boots. He had pinned a rattlesnake, and his buddies came over and quickly dispatched the snake, and then they cut off the head and the rattle for souvenirs. And they started, had the rest, and they started to mount again. And Brewer thought about it, and gee, we're scientists. That was kind of gross there. And he decided he'd measure what was left of the snake for science. So he bent down to measure the decapitated snake, and what was left of the body coiled up and struck at him, the headless body. And Brewer wrote, "It was several moments before I could compose myself enough to get back on the horse." Probably had to change his pants too. But occasionally we see rattlesnakes on our outings, not too often. Our local rattlesnake, the Northern Pacific rattlesnake, is not aggressive. Their instinct is to lie still if they can. First to slither away if they can. If they can't, they lie still and hope you don't notice them. And only as a last resort do they coil and try to warn you off. This one we saw on an outing to Sycamore Grove in Livermore. And I was kind of the trail sweep. And I actually had seen the snake to begin with off by the side. And everybody walked by 3 feet away, did not even notice it. And after I passed, I was the last, I pointed the snake out, and it waited till we were all gone, and then it finished slithering off into the underbrush there. So that's generally what they do. They're not aggressive at all. Most of the injuries from snake bites, they're all generally teenaged or males in their 20s with a blood alcohol level of 1.5, 1.5 or above, and they're trying to pick the snakes up. But we do have a flower that kind of is associated with rattlesnakes for a very odd reason. I think many of you will recognize this little shrub with its beautiful flower. It's one of our many species of paintbrush that we'll begin to see at the end of, probably at the end of February and the beginning of March. And paintbrush is a beautiful flower. The shrub is not necessarily a very good neighbor. It can live by itself. It is green. It can photosynthesize. But if it's close to other plants, in this case, it looks like this is black sage, and here's some coastal California sagebrush, paintbrush will stick its roots into its neighbors and steal water and minerals. So it's a semi-parasite, a hemiparasite, when it wants to be. So it's probably not a great neighbor there. But anyway, have those beautiful inflorescences, and it long puzzled botanists. What's the pollinator there? It's got this reddish, most of them have this reddish color, most of the paintbrushes, although those are the few that have a different color. But the red ones, well, red's not a bee color. Bees, their color is shifted to the shorter wavelengths. They like blue and yellow and gold, and they can see ultraviolet, but they can't see red. Secondly, this flower's got no scent to attract the bees. It's got no landing pad. So what in the world could pollinate it? Well, you can imagine people, early amateur botanists, Brewer gets a pass on this one, it wasn't him, bending over to examine a paintbrush and being startled by a rattlesnake nearby. So the legend grew up that paintbrush were pollinated by rattlesnakes. Now, that wasn't silly enough. That got it added on too. That's where rattlesnakes got their venom, from drinking from paintbrush. Well, a red flower with no scent and no landing pad, those of you that have bird feeders at home of a specific type have already guessed the pollinator of paintbrush, hummingbirds. Here's the relative of paintbrush, actually comes out a little bit earlier. Used to be called Indian warrior, and now it's warrior's plume. And it's the same deal. It's a hemiparasite, but quite a beautiful flower. The other name for it is lousewort, because legend had it that if you were a rancher or a farmer and you let your sheep graze amidst some warrior's plume, they'd come down with lice, which is not true either. So we see this quite a few places. We'll see it in the Marin Headlands. We'll have a wildflower walk there later in the year with David Schmidt, who's an environmental historian, and great place to see that early is Black Diamond Mines, where hopefully we'll be able to do a wildflower walk in the next few months. Well, okay, so the survey is sticking around Mount Diablo way too long to suit the legislature. They're getting annoyed. They want to know why they're spending all this time looking at flowers and at fossils when they're supposed to be finding out where the gold is. And they cut off their funds. And Whitney snapped. He got so angry. He said, "We've braved the perils of flood and field. We've avoided the friendly embrace of the grizzly bear. We've fallen into the jaws of the legislature." Well, they eventually got things patched up. But Whitney had had enough about 1864, and he headed back to Harvard, not before he got a parting shot off at the governor of California. He said the governor of California was a purveyor of alcohol and a denizen of the occult. The governor did not take it well. I don't think the governor was Mel Brooks at the time, but somebody close to that. And the interesting thing is, well, Whitney was our second official state geologist. A man named Trask, who was involved in formation, I think, of the Academy of Sciences, was first. But after Whitney left in a huff, the position of California state geologist went unfilled for 90 years. That's how aggravated the legislature was with geologists. We had an official state mineralogist, but no geologist for 90 years. So, and what about Brewer? Well, he left a few months later. He left all the plants that he had collected and all of his notes behind, and he headed back east. He eventually became a botany professor at Yale. I think he may have been the first botany professor at Yale. And he never got back to California, except very late in life, he came back to join the Harriman expedition to Alaska with John Muir. But all of his specimens and all of his notes, they were eventually put together again by students from UC Berkeley, grad students, I think from Jetsam Herbarium. And if you go to some of the big libraries around the Bay Area, I know the main branch of Contra Costa Library has this book in it. In the rare books section, it says Geological Survey of California. And you figure the book's about rocks, but then you look further down, it's all of Brewer's botany work. And that was really the big contribution of the Geologic Survey. It was in botany. And if you're interested, you can read all about what went on, at least for those 5 years that Brewer was with the expedition, because as I mentioned, he was the journal keeper. And he also wrote letters back to his brother and his family in New York. And long afterwards, they were assembled into a book, Up and Down California. Originally Yale University Press, where Brewer was a professor, and later UC Press. And it's still in print. I have this book, so you can read all about how their adventures and misadventures and about the tarantulas. And the interesting thing is, we had our huge rain for the past couple of weeks, and you read that it was really number 2 in terms of historical rain showers. They were there for the first one in January 1861. It rained every single day in January in San Francisco, and Brewer describes heading to Sacramento and having to get place to place in Sacramento by rowboat. So it's a kind of a timely book, Up and Down California. So getting near the end here, I just wanted, there's a couple of, mentioned geologists. And there's a couple of contributions that geologists made outside their field to natural history. And one has to do with scorpions. And we know that scorpions glow in ultraviolet light, kind of a strange thing. And it was geologists that first discovered that. It was not the Geological Survey, but it was late. It was in the 20th century. There were geologists out kind of on a spelunking expedition. They were looking for rare minerals that glow in UV light. So they had their UV flashlights, and somebody happened to shine his flashlight at a spot, and there materialized a scorpion, which probably upset him as much as it had set Brewer seeing the tarantula. And it's long puzzled entomologists why scorpions glow in UV light. What good does it do? I mean, they're active at night. We see them, they're actually quite widespread during the day. They're brown, they're kind of cryptic colored. They're under rocks and in crevices. And you see them all over the North Bay. We see them on Ring Mountain if you pick up a rock, or even in Muir Woods and in other East Bay parks. But at night, they glow in UV light. So what good does it do? I mean, there's no light in, be right back. Got a scratching dog. That was a maverick break. What good does it do to glow in UV light? Well, it turns out there is UV light at night. We don't see it, but ultraviolet light is the most prevalent color of light in the evening. And it turns out scientists have discovered that quite a few mammals, nocturnal mammals, can see UV light. There's actually a species of squirrel, not the one that we have around here, that glows in UV light. So, but what's the deal with the scorpions? Well, and it turns out it's actually, they don't see UV light either. There's a compound in their exoskeleton that converts UV light into this bluish green light, cyan light. So cyan, it's a toner color, right? But it's that blue-green color, and that's what the scorpions see. And again, but why? What good is it? So we had some entomologists just a couple of years ago that did an experiment. They blindfolded some scorpions. Don't think about too much. They blocked out their eyes, and they shined UV light on them. And the scorpions ran. They ran until they were out of the light. Then they tried another experiment where they just directly shined cyan light onto the scorpions, and they ran even faster. And what the scientists discovered, they didn't need their eyes. What was happening was that UV light was being converted to the cyan light, which was transmitted directly to the nervous system of the scorpion. And if it detected that light, it knew it was out in the open, and it better move pretty quick to some place where it didn't see the light, and it was under cover. Else it was likely to get eaten. So it's a defense mechanism. And you can come along on one of our evening outings that we do later in the year when it warms up, and we'll have our UV lights and you can test for yourself. So our local scorpions, the biggest one is the forest scorpion. It's only 2 or 3 inches long, and they're not dangerous either. They don't have the sweet disposition of the tarantulas, but they're not dangerous. The other big contribution of botanists, of geologists, was a discovery they made about turkey vultures. And these are pretty ubiquitous. Almost every park you go to, you might see them circling above. And vultures were originally, they were put in the raptor family. Of course, they're nature's scavengers. Nature's cleanup crew, they eat carrion. And they were originally considered raptors. Then they were moved to storks for a few years, but now they're back into raptors, which is fitting. But the puzzle, raptors have great eyesight, and many of them have great hearing, but they don't have much of a sense of smell. There's just not enough brain power left. And it was always assumed that The turkey vultures, they found their food with their keen eyesight. They could spot a rotting carcass from high above. And if that wasn't the case, maybe they could hear the flies buzzing. Well, about mid-20th century, there were some geologists who were working for a gas company, kind of engineer geologists. Their job was to travel along the Carrizo Plain in the Central Valley and find leaks in underground natural gas pipelines. And natural gas has no odor. It's odorless, so it's infused with methyl mercaptan, a gas that smells like rotting meat. That's how you can tell if there's a gas leak in your house. You can smell the methyl mercaptan. So that's what these geologists were sniffing for, to try to detect the underground leaks. And one of them noticed that wherever they had found a leak, and there had always been a kettle of turkey vultures circling overhead. And they correctly deduced that those turkey vultures were sniffing the methyl mercaptan, the rotting meat smell from the underground leak in the natural gas pipeline. It took a few decades for the ornithologists to believe them, but now it's very well established that turkey vultures find their food by sense of smell. They can smell dead stuff miles away. And you think it would be self-evident. You can daylight. You can look at one nostril and see daylight out of the other. Well, one last thing before we send you on your way. Well, we had the Nature's Grocery Store, the survival kit in the soap plant a while back. Last thing we're going to do, we'll send you along with our homeopathic first aid kit. So say you were on a hike. We always have first aid on our Greenbelt hikes, nothing to worry about. But say you were out hiking, somebody else or by yourself, and you fell down and skinned your knee. What are you going to do? Don't have a first aid kit. First thing you have to do is look for this flower, this plant, which most of us recognize as yarrow. A lot of us have it growing in our gardens. Really pretty flowers. It's called a umbel shape, an umbrella shape. And if you sniff it, it got a real faint overripe fruit smell, which is a big key to the pollinator. The main pollinator, lots of things visit it, but the main one are beetles. They were the very first insect pollinator, and they weren't very good at it. So if you depended on beetles, you better have lots of flowers. But anyway, what we're interested in, not the flowers this time, it's the leaves from the yarrow. They look like miniature fern stalks, miniature fern fronds. Looks like and the species name is millefolium, for 1,000 leaves. And what you need to do, and of course you wouldn't be in a regional park or a state park, you'd pick a leaf or two and grind it up. And it turns out that the Achillea millefolium, the yarrow, it's a poultice to staunch the flow of blood. It stops the flow of blood. And it was in fact in the medical kits of doctors, yarrow leaves all the way through the US Civil War, all the way through the 1860s. It got its species name Achillea because there's a closely related species that grows in Europe that they used to treat the wounds of Achilles' soldiers at the Battle of Troy. Achillea millefolium. We won't dawdle on this slide here. That's got to be, I'm noticing a glaring defect in that armor, so we'll move on. So you stop the bleeding. Now you want to get your antiseptic on there, and you have to look for a lichen, which we'll talk about more next month, specifically a beard lichen, Usnea, which has lots of chemicals, bacteria-fighting chemicals in the lichen. So you take a little wad of the beard lichen and put it on the wound to stop any chance of infection. Then you need a Band-Aid. You look for this plant, which grows we see this all over the Bay Area, from coastal areas to the the Huddish chaparral, sticky monkey flower. And the sticky part of the leaves, that's your bandage. You pick a leaf and you put it over there and you're good to go. And while you're trying to take your mind off your owie, take a look at the flowers. You have the dainty little flowers for the sticky monkey flower. This is the stigma at the end of the female part, the pistil. And the way this works is when an insect goes in to get nectar and to inadvertently gather pollen, presumably it's got pollen from another monkey flower. And it rubs it up against the stigma there, rubs off some pollen from another monkey flower. Then it goes in, and when it backs out, those lips are closed. See on this picture here? The lips are closed, so it doesn't self-pollinate. It's called a pressure-sensitive stigma or a thigmotropic stigma. So if you want to take your mind off the pain of your little ouchie, all you have to do is stick your pinky from your pinky fingernail in between those little lips, and that'll close in just a few seconds. It thinks you're an insect. And it's not fooled for long. It realizes it hasn't been pollinated, and then it opens up and it's good to go. And with that, I think we can call it quits for this presentation. We have one more next week, and we'll do on February 18th, and we'll do a lot more flowers and trees, because we'll be on the cusp of spring wildflower season. So I guess that's it. So Jesse, I just want to say I likened you to Jesse Fremont, which is probably apt. This is Jesse's leaving us from her permanent position after today. She's actually going on maternity leave. I hope I can say that, Jesse, for a few months, and then coming back as in a part-time position. We have Justin, I think, who signed in today. He'll be taking over for Jesse. But on behalf of myself and everybody else at Greenbelt, thank you so much. We can't thank you enough, and me personally, for all that you've done for us over the years. So thank you, Jesse.
Oh, thank you so much, Ken. I appreciate those words more than you know. And I'm glad that this was kind of my final hurrah in my role as director of the marketing and communications team and supporting our outings program, which is by far my favorite of the things we do at Greenbelt Alliance. So thank you, Ken. I do just want to remind folks who may have missed it that this virtual outing today was recorded. So we'll be sharing the link to this in an email, which you'll receive in your inbox in a few days. So look out for that. Also, as Ken mentioned, we have in-person outings primarily. And so keep an eye out for those on our website. Greenbelt.org/explore is where you can see those outings, and then also via our emails. So if you're subscribed to get our emails, you'll be in the loop there. And then also, I did want to bring up that if you love today's presentation and plan to attend our in-person outings in the future, if you're local to the Bay Area, you should check out our new guidebook. It's called Bay Area Flora and Fauna. It's a guide to native plants and animals around the region. And the way you get that guidebook is by becoming a monthly donor. So you just sign up to give, you give $10 or more a month, and you will automatically get that guidebook. And it's basically like having a little Ken in your pocket on your hikes. So it's definitely worth the donation. Plus,
That's very like having a tick attached to you.
No, it's got great information and fun facts, Ken. Don't discourage folks, because it really is a really interesting little book to take along with you. And right now we're only offering it to our monthly donors. So check that out. You can become a monthly donor by going to our website, greenbelt.org/donate, and then choosing the monthly option when you give. And not only do you support our outings program, but you'll also be supporting the really important work that our team is doing throughout the region to create climate resilience. So be sure and check that out. And with that, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today, for being a part of our community, for being a big part of my life. Thanks everyone and have a great weekend.